Hello, everybody. This is your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown. And today we are going to be visiting one of the grand avenues of the world. In this case, it is the Grand Avenue of the Pharaohs in Luxor, Egypt. Every major city has to have a grand avenue. Just recently, Charles III, King Charles III, was crowned as King of England, and not too far before that, Queen Elizabeth III was taken to her final resting place. Well, England has a grand avenue. It's called the Royal Way, which goes from Buckingham Palace down through part of London and ends at the Admiralty Arch. And this is the Grand Avenue of London, where royal events take place. Parades take place. All kinds of major events, celebrations of the birthdays of the monarchs with their golden chariot, the changing of the guards, soldiers marching up and down, victory after wars. Every city has to have a grand avenue. This past January, I was in Paris, and it was on the Champs-Élysées, where over 1 million people were welcoming in the new year. In New York, we have Fifth Avenue with all of the parades. We have Broadway with its famous ticker tape parades. Paseo de la Reforma in Mexico City, the Grand Avenue from the Royal Chapultepec Palace up to the center of the city. Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg. So every city has to have a stage for the celebration of its grand national rituals. Well, this idea goes back to prehistory, as we're going to see today with the Temple of Luxor and the ruins of the ancient capital of Egypt. We're going to see that this too was a grand avenue for history, for great celebrations, and even today it becomes a grand avenue for spectacular events. So our outline, spring 1978. That's me on the right as I looked in spring of 1978, a couple pounds lighter and with a nice head of hair. Well, everything changes. And then Luxor, the new capital for a new empire, building a brand new city to celebrate the new kingdom of Egypt. Karnak Palace, Luxor Temple, the Grand Avenue connecting the two, the Grand Avenue today, and the Grand Avenue in popular culture. So let's get started on our visit to the Grand Avenue of the Pharaohs. Here we see grand avenues. This is the Champs-Élysées. On the right, you see a big military parade. On the left, the Nazis organized a grand military parade down the Champs-Élysées to celebrate their victory. Below that, you see ticker tape parades. You see American flags with major events in New York and in Washington, around the world. Everybody has to have a grand avenue, and it is a stage. Well, when I went to Egypt, the situation was very interesting. Whenever I visit a city, I always say it is a meeting between me at a certain age and a city at a certain time. Well, I was in the Middle East in the spring of 1978. I had been in Israel during the Yom Kippur War, when Israel expanded, taking over the Golan Heights, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Sinai. realizing the dream of the Israelis to have an empire from the Nile to the Euphrates. Well, the Yom Kippur War was interesting, October 73. Well, by 1978, the country was in chaos. The Yom Kippur War, 73, had really thrown the Middle East into chaos. Not only had Israel expanded and kept its empire, but the Yom Kippur War was a disaster for Israel. Great leaders like Moshe Dayan, Golda Meir were accused of mismanaging the war and almost leading Israel into destruction. Well, I was studying during my doctorate at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. As you can see on the right is the new campus, not the one that I went to back in the mid-70s and early 80s. And one vacation, I decided to go to Egypt. There's me crawling up the pyramid. Most of these climbing of pyramids, whether it's in Egypt or in Mexico or China, you can't climb them anymore because, as you can see, those stones are pretty dangerous and too many people were getting killed. But when I was there back in 78, it was still possible to climb them. When I was there, Anwar Sadat was ruling Egypt. Jimmy Carter was in the White House, and Menachem Begin had replaced Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan and made Israel into a very different country. So there were three powerful leaders dominating the world when I went to Egypt. But then again, what better time to visit Egypt? I was living in Geneva, in Switzerland. I was working full-time, studying full-time, earning Swiss francs. And so I decided, well, what better time to visit this country? Who knew what was going to happen with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin in power? This whole situation could have blown up into still another war. So my attitude was visit Egypt while it was still possible and while I still had enough money. Well, 1 year after my visit, the Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin, and Anwar Sadat signed the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. So I was there in April of 78, and barely a year later, the monumental event of the peace treaty was signed. Well, of course, when I was there in April 78, I had no idea that the negotiations were already going on in Washington, in Tel Aviv, in Cairo, between the three powerful men. So it was, again, an exciting time to be there. And I love to travel to places at exciting times. A couple of years ago, I was in Ethiopia, and I got a warning from the State Department, an email saying, a war is going to break out soon, get out. Well, everybody was fleeing, trying to get out of the country, but I just decided to travel. And so I went up and almost got caught up in the war with the advancing troops. So travel when travel is interesting. So I went to Egypt. There's me on the Nile. At the bottom, there's me traveling with some friends, visiting the pyramids. On the right's another picture of the pyramids and the Abu Simbel temples up at the top. So I decided to really take advantage of my Swiss bank account, the peace which was currently and precariously in the Middle East, and having the free time. So the Grand Avenue, where does that fit into all of this? Well, from about the year 2050 to 1500 BC, before the Common Era, Egypt had been dominated by the people called the Hyksos. They were people from Asia, probably related to the Babylonians and the other people of the Middle East. They had invaded Egypt, coming down from the Middle East, conquered Egypt, and they dominated Egypt for almost 500 years. Well, of course, nobody likes to be dominated by a foreign people. The Egyptians, though, had sort of declined as an empire, and so the Hyksos invaded, conquered it, and took it over. Well, eventually the Egyptians decided they had enough of these foreign invaders who were not Egyptians, and so they rose in revolt. And this was the beginning in 1532 of what is called in Egyptian history a new empire, a new age. It was Pharaoh Ahmose I, who ruled from 1550 to 1525, who organized the resistance against the Hyksos, the liberator of Egypt. As you can see from the painting on the right, from his chariot, he is striking down the Hyksos, driving them out of Egypt, and restoring Egyptian greatness. Well, when you are a great leader and you accomplish something, of course, you want the world to know. When Donald Trump rose to power and influence, he built buildings all over the place, and he put his name on them. Trump Tower, Trump Casino, Trump Hotel, Trump Golf Course, you name it, he put his name on it. And so every great person, such as a liberator, wants the world to know of his greatness. Well, this began a new kingdom which lasted for 500 years. The new kingdom was a period of great glory. Names that we recognize: Tutankhamun, King Tut, one of the great rulers of the new kingdom; Thutmose III, military genius, who went out of Egypt, conquered down the Nile, across North Africa, into the Middle East. Nefertiti, and we see one of the great rulers of this new kingdom. Well, the new kingdom, we can see, fits into the history. The ancient two kingdoms going back to 4000 BC, a period of chaos. The Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, an age of chaos with the Hyksos conquest. Well, a brand new kingdom began, very long kingdom, and these were the ages of glory for ancient Egypt. Queen Hatshepsut, one of the great queens of this period, expanded Egypt down south to the land of Punt, which is today Ethiopia and Yemen and Sudan, up into the Middle East, taking over what is today Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, up into Syria, making Egypt one of the great world powers. So it was a new kingdom, but it was a time of glory. Well, any new kingdom needs a new capital. Well, George Washington, when he became the president of the United States, he felt, well, we have New York, we have Boston, we have Philadelphia, we have Richmond and Savannah, Georgia, and we have a lot of nice cities, but a new empire, as he called America, a new empire needed a new imperial city. So The liberator decided that it was time to build a new capital. Now, if you look at the map on the left, you see that there are capitals. On the coast is Alexandria. That was the capital of Egypt, built by Alexander the Great. You had Cairo, the capital built when the Arabs invaded and built a brand new city. Luxor, down on the Nile, another ancient capital of Egypt. So the liberator, the new dynasty, needed a new capital for its new empire. And so they set out to build the capital of Thebes and Luxor, down the Nile, deep into the heart of Egypt, not up on the delta like Cairo and Alexandria, but deep down the Nile, not far from the Aswan Dam, which you can see. Well, Egypt has had many capitals. Some we know about, some we don't even remember, such as Amarna, one of the great capital cities of Egypt, which doesn't even appear on maps anymore. It is just a pile of ruins. So Egypt is a country filled with imperial cities, each celebrating an empire. Well, Thebes and Luxor were built on the Nile. In fact, that's the only place where you can really build anything in Egypt. Well, on the western side of the Nile, you have the famous Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. And this is where some of the great rulers of the new dynasty built their tombs. Amenhotep II, Ramses III. At the very top, we see Queen Hatshepsut's temple, tomb. And this valley, as you can see on the right, is literally filled with the tombs of the pharaohs of the new empire, the new dynasty. In fact, they're constantly discovering new tombs all the time. See some hill and it looks perfectly abandoned, but today with modern technology, you can peer inside the mountain and discover stone temples, rooms, and tombs. So it's the Valley of the Kings, which is on the left side of the Nile. This is the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut in the Valley of the Kings. One of the great rulers of the new kingdom. She was one of the great queens, up there with Cleopatra in fame. And you can see how luxurious this temple is, with a long walkway up to the temple, through the pillars, and into the temple, a courtyard, and then a door leading inside the mountain where the tomb was actually located. Now, across the Nile were the two temples. First, we have the Temple of Karnak, which is at the upper left-hand corner. The Avenue of the Sphinx, the Grand Avenue, the Avenue of the Pharaoh, and then down to the Temple of Luxor. The modern town of Luxor is still there. So this was the centerpiece, the capital of a new empire, a new city for a new empire. Just like Peter the Great, when he united Russia, defeated the Swedes and the Poles, and took over huge area. Well, what was his first way to celebrate his great victory? Build a new capital city. And that is St. Petersburg, named after him and St. Peter. So here again, building a new city to celebrate the new empire is what people do. I was not long ago in Brazil, and I went to the new capital of Brasilia, carved out of the jungle and the forest deep into the interior of Brazil. Here again, turning its back on Europe and the old world and building a brand new ultra-modern city to celebrate the new Brazil. Well, many books have been written on the Temple of Karnak, the Avenue of the Sphinx, and the Luxor Temple. On the right, you see a book with introduction by one of the greatest of the Egyptian archaeologists, Zahi Hawass, who is still traveling around the world giving lectures celebrating the treasures of ancient Egypt. Well, surrounding the temple, there are all kinds of ruins. This is the Colosseum, this giant statues of Memnon. And as you can see, the temples of Egypt are very often decorated with historic scenes and with the text in hieroglyphs describing what events happened there. So because of these inscriptions, we know every king, we know their battles, we know the names of their wives and their children. And so it was a history that we know a lot about. Another thing you'll observe, if you look at the bottom picture on the left, you'll see 4 statues standing. Well, their heads have been removed. This is another chapter in Egyptian history. When the Muslims conquered Egypt, Muslims rejected idol worship. Statues, like the Jews, statues were forbidden. And so they would very often chop off the heads of these statues. Or on the right, the 2 big colossi, we see also that the faces have been removed to avoid any hint of idol worship. The Karnak Temple, the largest of the temples, dates from around 2055 BC, before Christ, or BCE, before the Common Era. It claims to be the largest religious building ever constructed, larger than St. Peter's in Rome or the mosques in Mecca and Medina. Well, here again, whenever you see the letters EST in any tourist description, always get suspicious. When you say the largest, do you mean by the number of people it could hold, floor space, interior volume, height? All of these are variables that you have to take into consideration. Here in New York, where I live, people are always saying, which is the biggest church? Well, here again, the rivalry between St. Patrick's Cathedral, St. John the Divine, on which is the largest. How do you determine the largest? But the picture on the left shows what it originally probably looked like. We have enough remnants of color on the facades of the buildings that we can get an idea of what the original colors were. Picture on the right shows the way it looks today. The colors have long faded because of the bitter sun of the Nile Valley. But originally, they were brilliantly painted. Now, the Luxor Temple, where the Grand Avenue begins, was dedicated to the rejuvenation of the pharaohs. So here it was a celebration of the pharaoh. It was here that the coronation ceremonies would take place. And we see from the picture on the right, we see the double crown. Upper Egypt is the southern part. And lower Egypt is the northern part. So the red crown is northern Egypt, which is the delta, and Upper Egypt, up into the mountains, is the white crown. And this was a long ceremony. Now, we just saw a very similar event just recently in London, where King Charles III was crowned and his wife Camilla was crowned queen. A very elaborate crowning ceremony with all of the festivities and concerts and parades down the Royal Avenue, the Mall of London, really gave an insight into the elaborate ceremonies for installing someone as the pharaoh. We get a similar insight when you have the crowning of a pope in Rome. Very ancient, elegant ceremonies going back over 2,000 years. So this is what took place in the Luxor Temple, crowning and major events. This is the coronation hall. We see again the statues, which have been largely defaced, the pillars, and you can see how huge these pillars are. Now they're open to the sky, but at one time you can see they were covered over with very often wooden beams, and a room was made protected from the sun and the sandstorms. And so the coronation of the pharaoh was the beginning of the pharaoh's reign. At the other end of the Grand Avenue is the Luxor Temple. And this dates from 1400 before the Common Era. On the left, we see some of the statues standing in front, which have retained their faces generally. And we see the famous obelisk of the Temple of Luxor. On the right, we see another view of the temple, and we see it is largely in a ruined state. But you can see they're still doing archaeological digs. At the top of the picture on the right, we see a big hole with a palm tree where they are continuing to excavate and discover new things. So at the north end of the Grand Avenue, we have the Temple of Karnak, where the pharaoh was crowned. At the other end of this long avenue of the Sphinxes is the Luxor Temple. And that's where we get the name for the town of Luxor. Now, if you look closely at the picture on the left, you'll see that there is one obelisk, but there is the base for a second obelisk, which is no longer there. This is the artistic recreation of the Temple of Luxor. You can see the two obelisks of Ramses II in front with the statues of the pharaoh Ramses II. You see the courtyard of Amenhotep II, various chapels to venerate various deities, a dock for bringing in necessary food for the people who lived and worked there, sanctuary, colonnades, courtyards, a lot of decorations. You see a water pool surrounded by trees. And at the bottom, on the left-hand corner, you see the grand processional way, which is the Grand Avenue of the Pharaohs, linking the two temples. So what happened to the second obelisk? Well, Napoleon invaded Egypt, mainly because he thought that it should be kept from Great Britain, who was the rising power. Well, he sort of inaugurated this craze for everything Egyptian. Fact, Louis Comfort Tiffany in New York designed jewelry and even designed entire houses and rooms in the Egyptian style. This was his Egyptomania. Everybody wanted a statue, or especially everybody wanted a obelisk. Well, the one obelisk from the Temple of Luxor is now in the Place de la Concorde in Paris, right beside the Louvre, where the Louvre ends on the right. Then you have the big Place de la Concorde, and in the middle is the fountain and the obelisk. New York got another obelisk as well. It's called Cleopatra's Needle, which is behind the Metropolitan Museum in Central Park. Now, the chief deity worshipped in Luxor was Amun-Ra. He was the chief of the Egyptian gods. It was believed that he was the creator of the universe. He was the ruler of the sun and light, the coming of the sun every morning. It was believed that he sat in the golden chariot, which was the sun, and rode the sun across the sky every day. His symbol is the double-plumed crown, which you see on the right. And you see in the middle picture, where you see a pharaoh with the crown, and on the right you see a stone carving. This was the chief Egyptian god. Now, each of the various crowns, whether it's the unification of Egypt, Upper and Lower and Nile, or crowns in honor of various gods, this is very common in royal times. As we just saw with the crowning of Charles III and Camilla. Big debate, which of the many crowns were they going to wear? And each crown had its own history. One of the crowns, which is very controversial, had a famous diamond, which it was India believes was stolen from India. And so the people around Charles III said it wouldn't be a good idea to start out your reign wearing a controversial crown. So the Avenue of the Pharaohs is linked between the Karnak Temple and the Temple of Luxor. In the middle on the right, we see Karnak Temple and Luxor with its lions, sphinxes lining it a grand way. And this is the area where the pharaohs, famous people, would carry out official duties. Now, you can imagine the pharaoh being carried down the avenue of the sphinxes, and the people, especially the important people, would be on their knees with their head in the sand because it was considered too impolite to look at the pharaoh. Victory processions would be held here, very much like the Champs-Élysées in Paris. Major births, major marriages would be celebrated along this grand avenue of the Sphinxes, sort of like Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, linking the White House and the Capitol building, where victory parades are held. Demonstrations are held, protesting this, that, or the other thing. Funerals are carried out on the Pennsylvania Avenue. Think of the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the parade marching slowly down Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to the Capitol building. These are some shots of the Avenue of the Sphinx, and we see many of the Sphinx have been defaced. Sometimes the Muslims would simply smash off the nose, and that was considered enough of a desecration. But others, the head was chopped off, and some of them were destroyed. That's me on the right, standing on the Avenue of the Sphinx, the Royal Avenue. Now, it doesn't look that wide because in Egypt, the family of the pharaoh was considered semi-divine. And so he wouldn't be surrounded by thousands of flag-waving, drum-beating supporters. Every procession down the Avenue of the Sphinx, the Grand Avenue, would be a solemn procession with priests, royal family, and aristocrats. It is 1.7 miles long from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple. Now, every avenue has a different length, but it is about 1 or 2 miles, which is standard. Champs-Élysées from the Place de la Concorde to the Arc de Triomphe is 1.1 miles. Tiananmen, the Grand Avenue of Beijing, is half a mile. Paseo de la Reforma in Mexico City is 9 miles long. Karl Marx Allee, 1.2 in East Berlin. Pennsylvania Avenue actually claims to be 35 miles long because Pennsylvania Avenue actually continues beyond the White House, and some people say it even goes up into Virginia or Maryland. Unter den Linden in Berlin is about 1 mile. The new Arbat Avenue in Moscow is almost 1 mile. So this is the Grand Avenue. That's me on the right. You see some of the stone carvings. Once again, they look very clean and crisp, but you have to realize they were painted in vibrant colors back then. Well, Thutmose III, one of the military geniuses, he ranks up there with Robert E. Lee as one of the brilliant generals of countries. But Thutmose III was the empire builder. He was the son of the pharaoh, the woman pharaoh Hatshepsut. And he expanded the empire. And not just Egypt today, but down into Sudan, to Ethiopia, taking over the Sinai, Palestine, the occupation of Jerusalem, Syria, Jordan, big chunk of modern-day Turkey, Babylon, and setting up puppet states in other places. So he was one of the great military geniuses of all time, and one of the great pharaohs who ruled from Karnak and Luxor. Along the Grand Avenue are approximately 600 sphinxes. I guess that's the plural of sphinx. Generally, they are a lion's body with a ram's head, or it can be the head of a lion or the head of a human. Sometimes they would even be given wings. Here again, combining the qualities, the strength of a lion, the intelligence of a human, a ram, bravery. So the wings of a falcon, falcons soaring up into the upper heavens. And so the Sphinx was a symbol of the qualities that a pharaoh would want to project. One of the main events along the Grand Avenue was the holiday of Opet. Opet is the benign hippopotamus goddess. In Egypt, the country would collapse collapse and be destroyed if it wasn't for the annual flooding of the Nile, when the rains in Ethiopia and Sudan and Africa bring down large quantities of water. The water rises up and floods the valley. It floods the delta, bringing in silt and water to make the Nile Valley fertile. Well, one of the big celebrations was a 24-day festival when the goddess Opet was carried along the Grand Avenue to thank the hippopotamus goddess for once again bringing the rains. And so you can see from the carving on the right, we see the men carrying a boat. And in the boat was the hippopotamus goddess, once again with all of the inscriptions around it. Now you can imagine again that this was brightly painted, beautiful colors. On the left, you see the hippopotamus goddess with the body of a woman, but the head of a hippopotamus. Various royal festivals would be held along the royal way. Well, of course, with so many tourists flooding into Egypt, very often there will be reenactments of major events or what people thought the events were. So you see people dressed in what they believe are traditional Egyptian costumes, and in this case, carrying boats with the various Egyptian gods and goddesses. The aristocrats would be carried through. Sometimes the pharaoh would be carried down along this 1 mile processional route from Karnak to Luxor temples. The 18th dynasty is what distinguished the new kingdom. This was a dynasty from 1550 to 1292 BC. The first of this dynasty was Ahmose I, the great liberator. And then we have Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, one of the most famous. And then came Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, who ruled from 1353 to 1336. Akhenaten's son was the famous boy king of Tutankhamun, and the last pharaoh of this 18th dynasty was Horemheb, the last pharaoh. Now, in the middle of this dynasty came one of the more interesting pharaohs, and this was Akhenaten. Akhenaten is the father of what we call in religious circles monotheism, that there is only one God. So he was a religious revolutionary. On the right, you see him with his wife Nefertiti behind him, worshiping the sun. He believed that it was the sun god who was not just the ruler of the universe, the creator of the universe, but he argued that this was the only God. And he systematically set about destroying the temples and killing off the priests of the temples of Egypt, from Karnak and Luxor and all over Egypt, building his own temples to the one and only God, the sun god. Well, he was a revolutionary, and we know a lot about him, even though his son, King Tutankhamun, tried to destroy monotheism and return to the ancient gods of Egypt, but Akhenaten left a powerful influence. In fact, many people say that it was Moses who was in Egypt at the same time as Akhenaten, and Moses got the idea of one and only one God from the ancient Egyptians. Sigmund Freud wrote his famous book, Moses and Monotheism. So once again, arguing that Moses in Egypt is what introduced the Jews to monotheism. The famous Amarna letters, cuneiform tablets, describe the teachings of Akhenaten, describe his life. And on the picture on the left, you see Moses with his beard on the left, and you see Akhenaten, the Pharaoh who introduced monotheism. Now, it's still controversial whether the Jews got their idea of monotheism from Egypt or not, but still, people like Sigmund Freud are firmly convinced that there was in Egypt that the Jews discovered the notion of monotheism. Well, be that controversial, still, it is interesting. Now, it's also interesting with Akhenaten, he also built a brand new city, and this was Amarna. He abandoned Karnak and Luxor and built a brand new city further down the Nile, which when Akhenaten died, his son, King Tut, returned to the ancient gods and returned to Karnak and Luxor, and Amarna was completely destroyed. Another example of a great ruler in need of a great imperial city. Well, Karnak and Luxor and the Royal Avenue today remain great tourist sites. In fact, the Egyptian government has been putting a fortune into making it into one of the great tourist sites of the world. In fact, I'm going to be leaving for there in about a month's time. So I will see some of the new festivities which resulted from the restoration that they did in the 20 and 21. And so Egypt is pouring a lot of money into the Grand Avenue of the Sphinx. And as we saw from some of the earlier pictures, they're having giant processions, recreation of ancient rituals, sort of in a Hollywood or a Las Vegas style. But still, it lends itself to that, brings in billions in tourist dollars, and is very, very popular. When the ceremony, when the temple area was reconstructed and revived, there was a whole series of great events. We see the ceremony for the revival. The Ram's Road, the Avenue of the Sphinx, was redone, and you can see it bathed in lights, colored lights, and fireworks. And this is really one of the great celebrations. The picture at the top, you see a recreation of what the temple must have looked like, with the two obelisks in their places and the statues of Ramses III lining the grand entrance. Here we see some more of the festivities which are put on for tourists: sound and light shows, music, dramatic processions, candles and lamps, and pharaohs in faux gold, carriages and chariots, horses and camels, and you name it. It is a magnificent sight to see, and of course brings in billions of dollars. Now this is being done, this modernization of these temples is being done all over Egypt. The Valley of the Kings is going forward with archaeological digs and more magnificent discoveries. The area around the pyramids is being turned into a magnificent tourist destination. Many people will say tourist traps, but still, it is a major source of money. And the archaeologists are discovering more and more all the time. And the brand new library in Alexandria is a major repository for a lot of this, as well as the Archaeological Museum in Cairo, which is expanding in leaps and bounds. Many of you may have seen the King Tut exhibit, which is touring the world. I happened to see it in Paris a couple of years ago. An absolutely magnificent display of some of the more recent archaeological discoveries. Some more views with the sound and light, and you can see the entrance to the Temple of Karnak with the one obelisk still standing. Some of the lamps for the big processions and dramatic displays of pharaohs coming out, and something which, of course, would probably have never happened at the in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh was considered too sacred to be seen by the people. But when you're talking about tourist dollars, I think the pharaoh has to make some concessions. Well, the situation got a bit confused during the coup of 2013. President Morsi, with the Muslim Brotherhood, took power, and he was overthrown by President El-Sisi, who is president today of Egypt. People call him president, others call him dictator, but he really is promoting tourism and promoting the restoration, even if it is a bit Hollywood-esque, but still, he is really pouring a lot of money into tourism, into celebrating Egypt's history. Now, this is a bit controversial. Many Egyptians say, well, this is our pagan past when we worshipped graven images and idols. And many Muslims say that this is emphasizing the wrong chapter in Egyptian history, that it is a Muslim country, and all of this fanfare for pagan statues is not a good thing. But money is important, and President El-Sisi is dedicated to the popularization of temples such as the Grand Avenue of the Pharaohs. Now, this issue between the ancient pagan past and the modern present situation is not unique to Egypt. The Shah of Iran restored Persepolis, and the great pagan capital of ancient Persia. Well, when the Shah of Iran took over, he said, enough of celebrating ancient pagan idol-worshipping history. We are a Muslim country. And in many countries, as we saw in Afghanistan, where ancient statues of the Buddha and of other religions would be destroyed because it is celebrating the wrong chapter in history. So here again, who writes the history of Egypt? Who writes the history of Iran or of Israel or of the United States? What part of the past are you going to celebrate? We see that in the United States with the removal of Civil War monuments, saying we should not be celebrating these traitors to the United States. Whereas other supporters say this is a very important chapter in American history and it should not be suppressed. The Avenue of the Sphinx in popular culture has captivated the imagination. We see the Luxor Casino in Las Vegas with a miniature Grand Avenue of the Sphinx. We see imitation pyramid, but at least Las Vegas is good because it is surrounded by authentic palm trees. Coming October 1993, Luxor Hotel and Casino. Queen Cleopatra had absolutely nothing to do with Karnak and Luxor. In fact, her ancestry was Greek. Her ancestors came over with Alexander the Great, and she lived in Alexandria. Her first language was Greek. Many people doubt that she even spoke Egyptian language because she was a Greek woman. Well, even though she had nothing to do with Karnak and Luxor, when Cecil B. DeMille made his famous movie of Cleopatra, you can see in the background that it is the temple of Karnak, which is featured. So even Cleopatra and her shenanigans with Richard Burton and Rex Harrison, still, she had to be put in a context which was very Egyptian, and what could be more Egyptian than Karnak and Luxor? Queen Cleopatra lived from 51 to 30 BC, just at the very end of the before the Common Era and the time of Caesar and Jesus. Aida, the opera by Giuseppe Verdi, once again, when it is staged at the Metropolitan Opera or in Milan or Paris or Moscow, once again, they draw upon the imagery of the temples of Karnak and Luxor. Of course, these are all made out of paper mache, but they once again return to Karnak and Luxor and the Avenue of the Sphinx, the Royal Avenue, for inspiration. In the film Exodus, God and Kings from 2014, once again featuring a modernized Avenue of the Sphinx with new statues, but still the Grand Avenue leading from Karnak to Luxor was associated with Moses and associated with what was going on in Israel and Egypt at the time. In the film Jedi of the Star Wars series, here again we see the importance of a grand avenue between two giant temples with statues on both sides. Here they're not the Sphinx, but they are soldiers. And you see at the end of the street, you see the giant temple of Luxor, once again evoking the Grand Avenue of the Pharaohs. There was a film, Luxor, which once again is a romantic film placed in Luxor. On the right, you see the temple of Luxor, love story. The mummy returns. Well, of course, you're going to have a mummy crawling out of a tomb somewhere. And where's he going to go? Well, to parade up and down the avenue of the Sphinx between Karnak and Luxor temples. So it's the Karnak and Luxor, the avenue of the pharaohs, still captivates people. It is associated with the golden age of Egyptian history, the new kingdom, when under the great pharaohs, Egypt was one of the great powers of the world. So even Sisi, President Sisi, highlights Karnak and Luxor, and he views himself as associated with the pharaohs who made Egypt great again. Well, so much for our visit to the Avenue of the Sphinx in ancient Egypt. Well, I'm still exploring grand avenues. On the left, you see me at the brand new capital of Brasilia, with a giant area from where I'm standing. On the right, you see the cathedral, you see museums, you see government offices, and right behind my head is the Parliament, the Congress of Brazil, and beside that is the Supreme Court and the Palace of the President of Brazil. Once again, a grand avenue where major events, parades, celebrations take place. In fact, they just had riots there when Lula returned to power and Bolsonaro's supporters tried to overthrow the election. Huge demonstrations taking place in this grand avenue behind me. On the right is me at Qingmen, the grand avenue, the grand axis of Beijing, Peking, going from the bell tower in the far north down to the Temple of Heaven and Agriculture at the bottom end of the Grand Avenue. Now, of course, the pollution in Beijing is pretty bad. So to get a picture like this one, I had to get up at about 5 o'clock in the morning, take advantage of the first rays of sun before the city was crowded over with acid pollution. It is improving. That's one of the reasons why China is in the forefront of electric cars. So, thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you sometime in the future for another exciting lecture with your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me at ronbrownmedia@gmail.com. So, thank you again, and I shall see you in the future.